Today's Guild Wars 2 Mysteries is on a short subject, but possibly a huge thing for the future of Cantha. The character I'm dedicating this video to could easily be a major factor in Living World Season 6 or beyond. And the mystery is honestly the best kind of mystery. It's an area of the lore that I think is really captivating, really interesting, but that so many players don't know about. And it's also a really easy mystery to understand. It was written by the devs to be specifically mysterious. I hate the thought of this storyline coming up later and people ending up just confused because they didn't follow things closely enough since the Guild Wars 1 days. So listen up, hopefully this will be fun, and let's crack on with it. What's especially funny about this video is this is a rare example of a topic I could have covered years and years and years back, but I didn't do it, so why? Well, if you're out of the loop, End of Dragons is now out, Cantha has returned, and that means a bunch of the old Canthan lore feels like it really matters again now, at least for one season. So now's the time to talk. Enter the Ministry of Purity and Xun Rao. So let's recap some fundamentals if you're feeling a bit hazy on these things, opening with what is the Ministry of Purity. Well, in End of Dragons, you've probably noticed these purist enemies you've been fighting. They're a xenophobic faction among the population who once, by Guild Wars 2's time, had great power in the government and acted as one of the major ministries in the whole region. When the Zaitan disaster struck, this is a point roughly halfway between the two games, the Ministry of Purity, in the fallout from that disaster, seized what looks to be near total power through a bunch of intrigue and what to me actually looks like the probable assassination of one emperor and the poisoning of another, but more on that in another video probably. Ultimately, the first empress of Cantha, a woman named Heibaragi, went to battle with the Ministry of Purity, leading to a mass slaughter at Zendaijun, and managed to disband them. Not just the Ministry of Purity, but also during her reign, the other ministries as well, of flame, water, and so on. But as the commander sees, in Guild Wars 2 as we've just played it for End of Dragons in the modern era, it's been like around 100 years since then, and purists are still lurking around, still clinging to their mindsets, still seeking power. And in fact, for a brief moment in the main storyline, we actually come into that conflict for ourselves. This is why things might matter as we go forwards into Season 6. But before we get there, let's back up even further. I really want you guys to have context about when the Ministry of Purity was introduced to this franchise's story. Because they were actually introduced in Guild Wars 1, not Guild Wars 2 here with End of Dragons. But you should get that when Cantha was first released to Guild Wars 1, there was no lore on any of this stuff or these kinds of people at all. Most people watching this video, I'd guess, who played Cantha in Guild Wars 1, probably had no clue about the Ministry of Purity at all because they weren't there. The storyline continued out of Cantha into Alona with Nightfall, and then after this they decided to make Guild Wars 2. They made a paid expansion, Eye of the North, to start introducing lore about the sequel, like the Asura, the Norn, the Sylvari, the Elder Dragons, and then, when Guild Wars 2 development went on longer than they expected, Guild Wars 1 started receiving a series of free content patches, just like the Living World. It was called Guild Wars Beyond, and it was the final chapter of Guild Wars Beyond, releasing right up next to the sequel's launch in 2012, called The Winds of Change, that finally the purists first appeared. I'm talking about the last real story content ever added to Guild Wars 1, and it came in at a time years and years after Guild Wars 1's heyday, and when many people had actually stopped playing. Most Cantha fans from Guild Wars 1 are probably thinking about Shiro and the Afflicted, not the Ministry of Purity. And here's the key point. Yes, the purists are Canthan lore, but they share more in common with all the lore written around Eye of the North and beyond, inasmuch as they were always written specifically to be a storyline the sequel would deal with. ArenaNet clearly had a plan for the purists, and so far in End of Dragons itself, when we're back to Cantha, We seem to have hardly even started it. The purists are there, they've had a bit of action, but not too much. Instead, End of Dragons has dealt with Aether Blades and Dragon Jade and the Void and the end of the cycle, which I think we can all agree was more rightfully the pressing concern for the commander. It's only now that that stuff is done that these things they were specifically setting up all those years ago will now probably come forwards. So Winds of Change told the story of the rise of the Ministry of Purity. The hero from the first game had been away from Cantha. They were adventuring, like I just said, in Alona, and in the far north, and in the depths of Tyria, and so on. And then when they got back to Cantha in Guild Wars Beyond, purists were suddenly around. The story in general is something of an analysis of the rise of fanaticism, absolutism, the way in which these Canthans isolated themselves willingly from the rest of the world. You can see how the purists encouraged the Canthan populations to stand up and fight for themselves. First, for genuinely virtuous reasons, like clearing away the remaining afflicted zombies from the continent, and then how those same people are propagandized and weaponized for increasingly morally dubious purposes, excessive force against the gangs of the cities, and finally, the genocide of other races such as the Tengu. The story ultimately concerns the head of the Ministry of Purity at the time, Minister Reiko, who suggested to have founded the thing. She, Minister Reiko, was the ultimate antagonist of the story, and at the end of Winds of Change, we defeat her on the Isle of Reflection. That's the location of the End of Dragons Guildhall, where we see all these purist squatters 250 years later. In some ways, I've always thought of Reiko as the final boss of all of Guild Wars 1. It's not Vizier Kilbron, it's not Shiro, it's not Abaddon, it's not the Great Destroyer. It's her. She was once in the Ministry of Flame, but had grown tired of the bureaucracy and established the Ministry of Purity to get things done, so to speak. Reiko had propagandized the people of Cantha with the sad story about how the afflicted plague had destroyed a family. The Udachi family, to whom Reiko was personally related, had been wiped out during an attack at the Tanakai Temple. She took one of only 2 survivors of that family, a young boy, her nephew, named Ashu, and she used him as a martyr to pull on the heartstrings of the country and rally people around her cause of fighting back against the afflicted and taking power for themselves. By the end of the story of Winds of Change, Reiko is dead, and her nephew, Ashu, having grown up around her, listening to her ideology, had adopted her worldview. Ashu becomes the leader of the Ministry of Purity later in life, and this is content the Guild Wars 1 player could no longer witness or see, and the Ministry of Purity marches onward and upward, until finally the Zaitan disaster and everything I described with Empress Heibaragi. Importantly, we don't actually get to see on screen those later details, or even the original details, like who Reiko may have been in contact with when the Ministry of Purity was founded, or who had influenced her. The Guild Wars 1 hero, as I said, was away at the time, and that's very important for today's mystery. See, Winds of Change had promotional press for it on the Guild Wars 1 website, and it gave us lore. It gave us quotes and art of various major characters in the story. Not many characters, but a couple. For example, here's Reiko, accompanied by a speech of hers appealing to the people of Cantha. And scrolling down, here's Miku, the final surviving family member who doesn't believe in what Reiko's talking about. And she's kind of one of our main new allies in the story. So you get those 2 characters. But then, last of all, and really, there's only one more character listed here. Who the hell is this? Xun Rao, Ecclesiate of the Ministry of Purity. Now they use that word Ecclesiate there. I believe the devs at a later time substantiated that as he's like the preacher. And here's what he has to say. Join the cause. Good people of Cantha, the time has come for you to take up arms. For too long now, our glorious lands have been tarnished as they wither in the shadows of fear and helplessness. When Shiro the Betrayer returned, he brought with him the affliction, and the plagued still walk these lands, spreading unabated. Great heroes rose up, and they sent the Betrayer back. But I ask you this, where are those heroes now? Where are they while the innocent seek what little shelter they can find, hoping to survive to see another day? Where is our great empire, and what has it done to protect the people? When a voice cries out for help, do they even hear it from behind the palace walls? Allow me to share with you a great truth as it was shared to me. Cantha is a land that does not need heroes. It is not a land that will tremble at looming threats. It is not a land that will stand aside, waiting for a savior. It is not a land where the people are so broken and weak that they cannot stand up for themselves. The strength that Cantha needs is the strength that comes in the moment when ordinary men and women confront that which holds them back, when they stand tall and proud, when their eyes shine with fierce determination, when their spirit burns brighter than even the sun, when the simple truth is known, they will no longer submit. Our strength is a strength that comes from purity of purpose, good people working together for a common cause. Ask yourself this: is there any greater future than the one you shape with your own hands? This is what the ministry is offering: the chance for a better tomorrow, a better Cantha, and most importantly, a better you. Believe me, friends, when I say that change is upon us. Will you be swept away by it, or will you stand at the forefront to see with your own eyes where it will lead? So there you can really see a lot of the themes of Winds of Change. Reasonable, great, well-delivered speeches that pretty much anyone can rally behind, and how that ultimately turns into something quite toxic down the line. Sounds like an important guy, right? He gets top billing on the official page, where only 2 other characters who are extremely important, Reiko and Miku, are there. Can't wait to play Winds of Change and see him in the game, right? Except we don't. Like, ever. Winds of Change comes and goes, and you never see Xun Rao. Now, the real-world explanation for this might be that the live team for Guild Wars 1, who was making these story chapters, had limited resources, and ultimately they couldn't include him, because of crunch, perhaps. For example, they'd once planned to have a whole extra chapter dealing with Alona and Palawa Joko, but none of that ever happened. There was an Elementalist balance patch, and then everything stopped right after Guild Wars 2's launch. But I did a video on that stuff already. Check it out if you missed it. So maybe Xun Rao was just a casualty like that. But here's the thing. The studio has openly said there is more to Xun Rao than just him getting cut from the Winds of Change. See, despite already knowing he was never going to be in the story, you can still find a bunch of canon references to him in-game, in-universe. A lot of equipment that you could earn in those later patches of Winds of Change were named after him. There was Xun Rao's Absolution here, this is a hammer. There was Xun Rao's Command, a scythe. Xun Rao's Justice was a wand that looked like a sword, and Xun Rao's Quill was a shield that looked like a knife. He even got a full-blown mini-pet. That's right, Xun Rao doesn't appear in the story, but he does appear as a mini in the game. A mini of a character we don't even see. Now that's pretty special, and it does mean that the devs were still actively encouraging us to think about him. If you're still not convinced Xun Rao matters, here's a comment from the head of the live team, John Stummy, who overlooked the implementation of this story, dated after the Winds of Change was over. On the wiki discussion page, the community at the time was joking that Reiko was just a puppet leader, needed to be used because the real Xun Rao is legitimately only 9 inches tall, like the mini. Sorry for butchering the joke here. Anyway, John responded saying, look, this joke, this comment has us figured out. Xun Rao is not only our first main character as a mini, he's also the first evil mini. Well, maybe not. I'll say nothing further on the matter of Xun Rao, except that what you see, or don't see, of him is intentional. Wow, so he does matter. Remember that context I just gave you? That all of this Winds of Change stuff was done specifically to set up and talk about how Tyria ends up in the sequel? And while doing that, they left this big mystery character behind. John left ArenaNet in 2014, as far as I can see, to work at PopCap's Plants vs. Zombies. Funnily enough, another franchise I love. So maybe I'm missing something, but I don't think there's any more contemporary comments or quotes about this one. Earlier in the video, I pointed out that this is all old info, and I could have done a mysteries episode on it at any time, but I held off. Hell, if you watch my Winds of Change playthrough, you can hear me talking about this guy a ton 7 or 8 years back. Why is it especially interesting now? Well, it's not just that Cantha and the Purist are back. It's because of some of the hidden story material buried beneath the surface at the end of Dragons. If you read the scattered notes and documents all around Xingji and New Kaineng, and you piece together what these documents are telling us, especially obvious if you do the endgame side quest, The Fall of the Celestial Ministry, by the way, I very much recommend it, you'll learn a bunch of new lore that they've just written for the game. As it turns out, many of these powerful ministers from Guild Wars 1's time, not just the Ministry of Purity but the others too, like Earth and Fire, they found a means to extend their lifespans to unnatural levels, like hundreds of years long. They're using something called the Celestial Blessing, and there's this huge conspiracy in End of Dragons about these parasitical lords of the city and what they might be doing now. Now, the matter of the Celestial Blessing, the activities of these ministers, the true nature of the Unchained, and what might be happening at Raisu Palace is its entire own Guild Wars Mysteries video, because there's an incredible amount of detail there, expanding massively on even almost random seeing Guild Wars 1 NPCs, and paying especially particular, careful attention to Reiko and Ashu and the previous lore. The studio knows the story of Guild Wars 1 extremely well, and they're blatantly building on it. But you know who remains conspicuously hidden despite all that detail? Xun Rao. So weirdly absent is detail on Xun Rao here in Guild Wars 2, when despite the fact that basically every other part of the Purist story's been expanded on, is enough to make me think he really does matter. Still performing the same role, a puppet master, hidden behind even all these other shady, mysterious characters of the Canthan Ministries. And thanks to the Celestial Blessing, he may still be around today, just as he was 250 years ago. And that's another episode of Guild Wars Mysteries. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Keep this guy in mind as the story outline goes along, and do let me know what you think. Is this just a dead-end story that died when the live team disbanded years ago? Or is Xun Rao still out there, ready to influence Season 6, or anything going further? Thanks again, plenty more to come, and I'll see you next time.